Welcome back to Study Hall, where we like to take these really dense and complicated topics and try to break them down into something that you can actually use.
Yeah.
And today, we're going to be tackling a recent executive order from the Trump administration. And this is all about Ansar Allah in Yemen. You might know them as the Houthis.
Right.
And the possibility of them being designated as a foreign terrorist organization, a so-called FTO.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about this particular designation is it's not just some bureaucratic formality. This actually has teeth.
Right.
It really gives the U.S. government an arsenal of tools to try and disrupt a group's activities.
So let's break this down for our fellow learners here.
Sure.
First things first, what exactly does it mean to be labeled an FTO, and why is this particular decision causing such a stir? Like, what are the real-world implications?
Well, when you designate a group as an FTO, you're basically hitting the sanctions button on a global scale.
Okay.
So you're talking about freezing assets, you're blocking financial transactions, you can even slap travel bans on members. So it's really designed to kind of financially suffocate the group and limit their ability to operate globally.
So really cutting them off.
Yeah, you're trying to cut them off, you're trying to isolate them. And the reason this is so complex, though, is because of the potential fallout. It's not as simple as saying, bad guys, let's stop them.
Right. There's always that ripple effect.
Always a ripple effect.
So let's zoom in on this executive order. What exactly prompted the Trump administration to even take this step?
Well, the order itself points to a laundry list of actions by Ansar Allah that they say justify this designation.
Okay.
And we're talking about attacks on U.S. Navy warships.
Right.
You've got attacks on civilian infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, and the UAE even projectiles fired at Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can't forget about those attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea.
Right. So they're trying to paint this picture. This is not just contained to Yemen. This is something that is going to have global implications.
Right. It's not just an internal Yemeni conflict anymore. This has regional and even global security implications.
And I think it's also interesting that they specifically called out Iran's support for Ansar Allah.
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
And we're going to dig into that connection a little bit later. But first, what is the process that the executive order lays out? Is this a done deal, or is there more to the story?
Well, it's not a done deal yet. The order sets a 30-day deadline for the Secretary of State, along with the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of the Treasury, to report back to the president on this FTO designation.
Okay.
And then they get another 15 days. Within 15 days of that report, the Secretary of State has to actually make a decision.
Okay, so it seems measured, but you could also see it as building a case in a very calculated way.
Yeah, it's definitely a calculated move.
So something that really stood out to me was the mention of USAID, the United States Agency for International Development.
Yeah.
What could this mean for their work in Yemen?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah, are we talking about collateral damage?
Potentially, yeah. So the order directs USA to do this deep dive on all their partners in Yemen, including NGOs and contractors.
Okay.
And they have to identify any groups that have, for example, made payments to Ansar Allah or criticize international efforts against them without, let's say, sufficient documentation of abuses.
Mm-hmm.
So the implication here is that USAID funding could be yanked.
Wow, that is a really big deal.
It is.
Because on one hand, you have all of these actions by Ansar Allah that are being used to justify this FTO label. And then on the other hand, you have the potential for this to really backfire on humanitarian aid.
Right.
And the very people who are trying to alleviate the suffering in Yemen.
Yeah, how do you balance those competing priorities?
How do you even begin to balance those?
That's the question.
That's a tough one.
It is. That's the dilemma at the heart of this whole thing. How do you target a group without causing collateral damage?
Right.
And especially in a place like Yemen, which is already grappling with such dire humanitarian needs, it's incredibly complex.
So let's unpack the arguments both for and against this designation. What are the strongest points on either side?
Okay, well, those who support the designation, they argue that it's all about enhancing security, acting as a deterrent, strengthening alliances in the region, protecting global trade, and ultimately holding Ansar Allah accountable for their actions.
Okay, so a lot of different arguments there.
A lot of different arguments.
Let's take the security argument first. How would this designation actually enhance security?
Well, the idea is that by designating them as a terrorist organization, you give the U.S. government these tools to freeze their assets, to choke off their financial flows, to restrict their movement. So it's really about cutting off their oxygen supply.
So a very direct and tactical approach.
Exactly. It's going after their ability to function.
Okay, what about the deterrence argument? How would this FTO label deter future actions, either by Ansar Allah or other groups that are looking at this and seeing what's happening?
Well, it's all about sending a message. By designating them as terrorists, the U.S. is basically saying we will not tolerate these actions and there will be consequences.
Right.
And so the hope is that this will make Ansar Allah and anyone else thinking of following in their footsteps think twice.
So it's about establishing a red line, a precedent.
Exactly, a precedent that others will be wary of crossing.
Okay, so let's move on to alliances. We've heard this a lot in the news. How would this designation affect alliances in the region?
Well, you have to remember that a lot of U.S. allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, they've all been targets of Ansar Allah.
Right.
So this designation is a way for the U.S. to stand with its allies and say, we've got your back, we're in this together.
It's presenting this united front against a common enemy.
Exactly.
Okay, and we talked a little bit about security alliances, deterrence. What about this argument regarding global trade? How does that factor into all of this?
Well, remember those attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea?
Right.
That's a major shipping route.
Hugely important.
Vital for global commerce. And so by going after Ansar Allah, the U.S. is basically signaling that they are committed to protecting those trade routes, keeping those goods and services flowing.
So there's an economic dimension to this.
Absolutely.
Not just a political or military dimension.
It's about protecting the arteries of the global economy.
So there's a lot at stake here.
There is.
And then the last argument that you brought up was the accountability piece.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Sure. So Ansar Allah has been accused of some pretty horrific things. Human rights violations, attacks on civilians, even using child soldiers.
Right.
And so an FTO designation is a way to formally condemn those actions and hopefully pave the way for some kind of justice or accountability.
Right. So holding them responsible for those actions.
Exactly.
Okay, so those are some of the arguments in favor of this designation. But I think it's important for all of our listeners to understand that this isn't a simple black and white decision. There are a lot of different arguments against labeling Ansar Allah as an FTO as well.
Absolutely. And I think the main concerns that people have revolve around the potential humanitarian impact.
Okay.
The possibility of actually escalating the conflict, the economic consequences for Yemen, the negative effects on the civilians who are living under Ansar Allah's control, and then you also have the potential for some diplomatic blowback.
Right. So let's start with those humanitarian concerns. What are aid organizations saying about this potential designation, and what, if anything, is being done to kind of shield civilians from the fallout?
Well, aid organizations are pulling out all the stops right now. They're urging the U.S. government to consider the humanitarian consequences.
Right.
They're calling for safeguards, exemptions, anything that will allow aid to continue flowing to the people who need it most.
Okay.
Some groups are even looking at alternative ways to deliver aid just in case the main channels get blocked.
So they're trying to prepare.
They're scrambling to find workarounds because they know how devastating this could be.
Because we're talking about a country that is already on the brink of famine, right?
Exactly. Millions of people are dependent on aid just to survive.
And this could push them over the edge.
It could. It's a very real concern.
So it seems like there's this real tension, this dilemma between these security concerns that we've talked about and these humanitarian concerns.
Absolutely. It's a classic case of how do you strike a target without causing collateral damage,
Right.
Especially when you're dealing with a population that's already so vulnerable.
And what about the potential for escalating the conflict? How could this designation actually make things worse?
Well, you have to think about it from Ansar Allah's perspective.
Right.
They're already fighting a war.
Right.
And now they're being labeled as terrorists by a global superpower.
Right.
This could easily be seen as a provocation, a justification to ramp up their attacks and dig in their heels.
Yeah. So instead of deterring violence, it could actually fuel it.
It's a risk.
Okay. And then you mentioned the economic consequences for Yemen. How could this designation impact their already fragile economy?
Their economy is in shambles from years of war. And this designation could further cripple it. You know, it could scare off foreign investment. It could disrupt trade, potentially lead to a mass exodus of capital.
Yeah, it's like kicking someone when they're already down.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the people, the everyday Yemenis who are living under Ansar Allah's control.
Right. These are real people.
Real people with families, with lives.
Yeah.
And they're caught in the middle of this.
So how could this impact their lives specifically?
Well, Ansar Allah controls a significant chunk of Yemen, including the capital Sana'a.
Right.
Millions of people live under their rule, so when you impose sanctions and restrictions on the group, you're inevitably impacting the lives of those civilians. It could mean shortages of food, water, medicine, everything.
So it's almost impossible to isolate the group from the people that they govern.
It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah. And then lastly, you mentioned that this potential for diplomatic fallout.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, the executive order specifically mentions Iran's support for Ansar Allah, and this could escalate tensions with Iran, which is already a major point of friction for the U.S.
A huge point of friction.
Huge.
Yeah.
And it could also strain relations with other countries that have ties to Ansar Allah, further complicating any efforts to find a diplomatic solution to this conflict.
So it sounds like this decision could have a ripple effect, not just in Yemen, but throughout the entire region.
Absolutely. It's a classic case of how a seemingly isolated event can have far-reaching consequences.
Wow. So we've covered a lot of ground here, and I think our listeners deserve a chance to digest all of this information.
I agree. Welcome back to Study Hall. You know, where we left off, we were really laying out the arguments for and against this designation and highlighting that tightrope walk between security concerns and these humanitarian considerations.
Yeah, and we touched on Iran's role a little bit, which is where I kind of want to pick up now, because this executive order keeps name-dropping Iran, talking about their support for Ansar Allah. So I guess the question is, why are they so important in this whole situation, and what could this FTO designation actually mean for Iran?
Well, you've hit on a really key point here. The conflict in Yemen, it's often seen as a proxy war.
Okay.
It's a battleground where bigger players like Iran and Saudi Arabia are kind of pulling the strings, backing opposing sides.
So Iran is on Team Ansar Allah.
You got it.
And Saudi Arabia is on the side of the internationally recognized Yemeni government.
That's right.
So it's like a power struggle, but it's playing out on Yemeni soil.
Exactly. And Iran sees Ansar Allah as this valuable pawn, a way to project their influence in the region and counter Saudi Arabia's dominance.
I see.
They've been accused of funneling weapons, providing training, even bankrolling Ansar Allah's operations.
Which probably explains why Ansar Allah has been able to hold their own for so long against this Saudi-led coalition.
It's definitely a factor.
So it makes sense why the executive order is calling out Iran specifically. But I have to wonder, how might this FTO designation impact the relationship between the U.S. and Iran? Because, let's be real, things aren't exactly peachy between them right now.
No, not at all. And it's hard to imagine this leading to any kind of reconciliation, in fact. Some analysts are worried that it could actually make things worse, push the U.S. and Iran closer to a confrontation. Iran has already condemned the move and vowed to double down on their support for Ansar Allah.
So the potential for blowback is there.
Yeah, unintended consequences that could destabilize the region even further.
So to really understand this, we need to zoom out a little bit, look at this broader geopolitical chessboard.
I agree.
So the U.S. sees Iran as this major threat to their interests in the Middle East. They accuse them of supporting terrorism and destabilizing the region.
Right. They've been trying to contain Iran for years.
And this conflict in Yemen is just one piece of that much larger puzzle.
Exactly. And the U.S. has been trying to contain Iran for years, hitting them with sanctions, trying to isolate them diplomatically.
Right.
This potential FTO designation for Ansar Allah, you could see it as another move in that game.
A way to squeeze Iran, limit their ability to kind of flex their muscles in the region through groups like Ansar Allah.
Precisely.
But is that really the right move?
Well, that's the debate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Some argue that this kind of pressure is counterproductive, that it pushes Iran further away and makes them more resistant to U.S. influence. It's a delicate balancing act trying to apply pressure without triggering a full-blown crisis.
Okay, so speaking of crisis, what are the potential regional implications of this FTO designation? I mean, we talked about the U.S. and Iran, but how could this impact the broader Middle East?
Well, the Middle East is a tinderbox right now.
Right.
And this could easily inflame tensions across the region, leading to more instability and possibly even a wider conflict. And then you have to think about groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Right.
They thrive on chaos.
Yeah.
And they might see this as an opportunity to exploit the situation to their advantage.
So we could be creating a vacuum
Potentially.
that even more dangerous groups could fill.
It's a valid concern, and it really highlights the need for a nuanced approach. One that takes into account all of the potential ripple effects.
Right, because it's not just about making a decision, it's about managing the consequences.
Absolutely thinking several steps ahead.
Yeah.
It's like a game of geopolitical chess.
Where every move has implications.
Exactly. And in this game, the stakes couldn't be higher.
Because millions of lives are hanging in the balance.
And that brings us back to that humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, the elephant in the room.
Exactly.
Let's talk about worst-case scenario here. What happens if, despite everyone's best efforts, this FTO designation actually does cripple the flow of aid into Yemen?
Well, it's not a pretty picture. We're talking about a country that's already on the brink of famine.
Right.
Millions of people are dependent on aid just to survive.
So imagine if aid groups are forced to pull back or even shut down.
Right, because of the risks and complications of working with a designated terrorist organization.
Right.
Hospitals could run out of supplies, food distributions could grind to a halt, clean water could become scarce.
So we're talking about a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe.
It's a very real possibility, and that's why so many people are urging caution.
Right.
They're demanding a thorough assessment of the potential consequences before any irreversible decisions are made.
Because good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes.
That's right.
And sometimes the best way to help is to avoid making things worse.
I agree.
So we've seen that this isn't just about Ansar Allah.
Right.
It's about regional power dynamics,
The U.S.-Iran rivalry,
the fragile state of Yemen.
and the people who are caught in the crossfire.
So it's a tangled web.
It is.
And finding a way forward requires a deep understanding of all of these different threads. But before we go any further, I think it's important to take a closer look at Ansar Allah themselves.
I think so too.
We've talked about their actions, their ties to Iran, but what do they actually believe in?
Right.
What are they fighting for?
Well, Ansar Allah, also known as the Houthis, they're a Zaidi Shia Muslim group,
Okay.
and they emerged in northern Yemen in the 1990s,
Hmm.
inspired by Hussein Badreddin al-Houthi.
Okay.
He was a prominent cleric who's killed by the Yemeni government back in 2004.
So their roots are in this specific religious sect within Yemen.
That's right.
So what are some of their core beliefs and grievances?
Well, their ideology is kind of this mix of religious, political, and social elements. They want to go back to traditional Zaidi values, and they see the Yemeni government as corrupt and illegitimate.
Okay.
And they're also deeply anti-Western, particularly against the U.S. and Israel.
So they're fighting against what they perceive as a corrupt system both within Yemen and then also on this global scale.
They see the U.S. and its allies, especially Saudi Arabia,
Okay.
as propping up the Yemeni government and undermining their interests.
That explains a lot, the attacks on Saudi infrastructure, the targeting of U.S. warships, even those projectiles fired towards Israel. It's all part of that same struggle for them.
They believe they are fighting a righteous war, a resistance movement against oppression.
And whether we agree with their methods or not, I think it's important to understand where they're coming from.
I agree.
Because it helps us to grapple with this complexity.
Absolutely. It reminds us that conflicts are rarely black and white.
Right.
They often involve these deeply held beliefs, these historical grievances and clashes of worldview.
So with that in mind, let's shift gears a little bit and look at the potential consequences of an FTO designation from a more practical standpoint. And we've talked about this big picture, but how would this actually play out on the ground?
Yeah.
What are the mechanisms, the legal tools, the day-to-day implications for Ansar Allah?
So an FTO designation, it's not just symbolic. It comes with this whole toolkit of legal and practical measures that are designed to disrupt the designated group's activities. And we're talking about things like freezing assets, blocking financial transactions, and imposing travel bans on members.
So it's this multi-pronged attack targeting their finances, their movements, their ability to operate.
Exactly.
So, so who are the main players here? Who's actually implementing these measures?
Well, the U.S. Treasury Department is the main player when it comes to financial sanctions. They're the ones who go after any assets that Ansar Allah might have within U.S. jurisdiction or that pass through the U.S. financial system.
So even if Ansar Allah doesn't have a bank account, in Manhattan, this designation could still mess with their ability to move money around the world.
You got it. The U.S. dollar is king, and the U.S. financial system is deeply integrated with global markets. So that gives the U.S. a lot of leverage to enforce sanctions and squeeze those financial flows.
It's like cutting off their oxygen.
Exactly.
And what about those travel bans? What impact could those have?
Well, they make it impossible for members of Ansar Allah to enter the U.S. And it could also make it much harder for them to travel internationally because other countries often cooperate with these kinds of restrictions.
So it's about isolating them, limiting their movement and their connections to the outside world.
Exactly. The goal is to disrupt their networks, make it harder for them to operate, and ultimately pressure them to change their behavior.
So it's this comprehensive approach trying to hit them from all angles.
Yes.
But the question remains, will it actually work?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, there's no guarantee.
Right.
It depends on a lot of factors, including Ansar Allah's resilience, their ability to adapt, and the level of international cooperation in enforcing the designation.
So even with all these tools at their disposal, there's no silver bullet?
There isn't.
It just shows how difficult it is to counter these determined and well-organized groups, especially in these complex and volatile environments like Yemen.
You're absolutely right. It's a reminder that there are no easy answers when it comes to counterterrorism.
Right.
It requires a long-term strategy, a deep understanding of the situation.
And a willingness to adapt.
Absolutely. You have to be able to adjust course if necessary and acknowledge any unintended consequences.
Because as we've seen, those unintended consequences can be just as impactful as the intended effects.
I agree. Flexibility and adaptability are key.
Yeah.
And as we've discussed throughout this deep dive, it's crucial to weigh those potential costs and benefits before making decisions that could have these far-reaching consequences.
And that brings us to a really critical point in our discussion. We've explored the arguments for and against this FTO designation. We've looked at the potential implications for Yemen, the region, U.S.-Iran relations. We've examined the mechanics of how this designation is implemented. But at the end of the day, the decision rests with the U.S. government.
That's right.
So what factors should policymakers be considering when making this decision? What questions should they be asking themselves as they weigh these costs and benefits? Welcome back to Study Hall,
where we've been really wrestling with this incredibly thorny issue of a potential FTO designation for Ansar Allah.
And we've really dug deep into all sides of this issue.
We have.
And I think it's safe to say there's no easy answers here.
Not at all. This isn't just good guys versus bad guys.
Right.
You've got competing interests, you've got security concerns, you've got humanitarian needs, and then you've got these regional power struggles that we talked about.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to make sure that we leave our listeners with some food for thought.
Of course.
We've tried to give you the knowledge and the context you need to really form your own opinions on this very, very complex issue.
We've tried to not shy away from the nuance, the gray areas, the tough questions, because those are the things that are essential to understanding these kinds of global challenges.
So as you continue to learn about this situation, we encourage you to think critically, challenge assumptions, and consider different viewpoints.
Because the world is interconnected.
Right.
And the decisions that are made in one place can have ripple effects across the globe.
And so that brings me to my final question for you.
Sure.
What factors should policymakers really prioritize when they're making decisions that has such profound implications?
Well, I think first and foremost, they need to ask themselves, is an FTO designation really the most effective way to achieve their goals? Will it actually weaken Ansar Allah? Will it actually deter future attacks? Will it disrupt their ties to Iran? Or are there other strategies that might be more effective?
So not just assuming that it will work, but really evaluating what that potential impact might be.
Precisely, and equally important, they need to consider the downsides, those unintended consequences.
Right.
What will this mean for humanitarian aid?
Yeah.
Will it escalate the conflict?
Right.
What are the economic implications for Yemen? How will this impact civilians who are living under Ansar Allah's control? Could this destabilize the region or even embolden other extremist groups? These are the tough questions that need to be grappled with.
So no easy answers.
Not in this case. The goal should be to find a path toward peace and stability in Yemen.
Right.
A path that prioritizes the well-being of its people and lays the foundation for a brighter future.
Easier said than done.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But even in the face of complexity, we can't give up on that goal.
Right.
We have to keep searching for solutions that prioritize peace, justice, and human dignity.
So for all of our fellow learners out there, this deep dive is just the beginning.
Keep learning.
Stay curious.
Keep exploring. And never stop asking those tough questions.
That's right.
Until next time, keep diving deep.